In this episode of my digital Lego city, I'm building up this empty space in the middle of my layout. I actually spent quite a bit of time considering what should go here. The simplest option would have been to add a parking lot and fill it up with trucks and pallets, but I wanted to avoid using filler just to occupy space in my layout. I really want each part of my city to mean something to me, and I'd rather spend the extra time creating something I find interesting or want rather than just having fast growth. While this approach means I spend more time seeking inspiration and letting ideas simmer before pulling the trigger, it also ensures that every corner of my city means something, and that's important to me. But to start off, I finished off the back of the plastics factory. First, I added more detail to the corrugated metal overhang. In my initial version, I thought it might be okay, but the more I looked at it, it looked a bit too boring. It was always something in the back of my mind, but looking at it for a few weeks made me want to change it up. So I added additional piping, doors, and exhaust systems, just to break up the repeated corrugated pattern and make it look less boring. Underneath this structure, I added another spur track with a loading area for covered hoppers and chemical tank cars. There is a platform with various loading arms to service tank cars, and while not visible, I'd imagine there's additional equipment above to handle the loading of covered hoppers. A staircase allows access to the upper machinery levels. The spur ends with this North American style track stopper, and I really like the look of it. The stopper is made using a slope piece, inverted cutout, and a rounded slope curve. I think it's a pretty decent representation of the wheel stops I see quite frequently where I live, though now that I'm actually trying to find a decent picture, I can't seem to find one. But they look like this. And here's a HO scale model of a freshly painted one. As a kid, I used to play around abandoned tracks, and we would climb around them frequently. For the main courtyard, I didn't want to leave it just as a parking lot, and I really wanted to add something of interest. Recently, I've been watching various YouTubers explore the British canals, and I've been getting ideas and inspiration from the architecture and design of these old waterways. Once vital for servicing dense industrial areas like Birmingham, they are filled with character and a rich history. Like old railway tracks, many have been removed with only hints of their existence. Sometimes it's a branch that splits and goes nowhere, or other times, they are disused stubs, now overgrown with weeds. I especially like the disused stubs as they give a similar vibe to old unused spur tracks. I also found it really cool that the canals travel in tunnels, underneath factories, warehouses, and even large apartment buildings. This gives me a lot of great ideas of the things I want to incorporate in my Lego city. So I thought it would be far more interesting to introduce some height variation by carving out a section and transforming it into an old disused canal stub. The way I see it, in the past, some cargo would have been brought by the canal as it travels through the tunnel under the large warehouse and ends at an opening by the plastics factory. The factory here wouldn't have been a plastics factory back then, but something else. That's the great thing about industrial buildings, they tend to be reused and modified as needed. The canal would have been facing decreasing traffic once the rail spur was built, and after a while, just fallen into disrepair and abandoned. Being too costly to fill in, some heavyweight grates were built to allow for larger truck traffic, but the canal was largely left to let nature take over. Over the canal, we can see some leftover infrastructure, like cranes that would have been used to lift cargo from the barges. I've also left the old staircase that would have been used to let workers access the canal. The top entrance has been graded over so trucks can move around, and the bottom planked off. The canal itself is fully overgrown with weeds and really swampy at the end. I've added a couple sunken narrowboats. These I found for free on Bricklink. I've added any free downloads used in this part of the city in the description box below. Now I know that narrowboats are not prototypical in my North American style city, but I think narrowboat canals are ideal because they allow for sharp curves and other interesting features that work better in my Lego layout, so I'm okay with it. In addition to weeds, there's a lot of floating garbage, but even then, there's still life in the canals, and we see some people have decided to do some fishing and set up a little shelter. The stub-in is at the end of a longish winding tunnel that branches off the main canal. The main canal is going to be over here someplace. The entrance to the stub is fenced off, but behind the fence, the canal travels into darkness. To round off the details of the courtyard, I've added some pallets of cargo being worked on. These vehicles can be found on Rebrickable. Links in the description. The boss is checking things out. He looks happy because everyone's working. I felt like this area would get lots of freight traffic in the parking lot, so I think having a semi-truck, like this Lego City one, being unloaded would work here. I also wanted the spur to get lots of use with trains dropping off chemicals. However, when creating the scene and laying out the trains and trucks, I wanted to leave the middle of the courtyard empty so I don't obscure too much of the loading platform and all the piping details underneath the overhang. That's it for this episode. I've got something really exciting planned just a little further down the line, and I'm also building a restaurant project right across the street from Davison's warehouse. Those are a couple of the exciting things coming up. Plus, there's a behind the scenes video in the works, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching.